My sister leaned across the dinner table and said, "We only invited you out of pity. Don't stay long." My dad laughed into his glass. "She's always been a failure." The waiter froze. Other tables went quiet. I smiled, took a slow sip of my drink, and stood up without saying a word. They thought that was the end of it. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever been treated like this by family, hit like and subscribe, because this story proves what happens when you stop staying silent. 1 week later, the family cabin was sold. The joint accounts were closed. And the bank statements started arriving. My sister leaned forward over the candlelit table and said, "We only invited you out of pity. Don't stay long." Her voice was calm, practiced, like she'd rehearsed it on the drive over. My father laughed immediately. A short, sharp sound. "She's always been a failure," he said, lifting his glass like he was making a toast. The table went still. Forks paused mid-air. The waiter stood there pretending not to hear, eyes fixed on the floor. I felt every pair of eyes slide toward me, waiting for a reaction. Tears. Anger, begging. I didn't give them anything. I smiled. Not wide. Just enough to be polite. I picked up my drink, took a slow sip, set the glass down, and pushed my chair back. No argument. No defense. No explanation. I walked out of the restaurant alone. My heels clicking against the tile, my back straight. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew they were watching, confused by my silence, annoyed that I hadn't played my part. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. It stung my lungs. My hands were steady when I unlocked my car, but my chest felt hollow. Like something had finally been scraped clean. That dinner wasn't an accident. It never was. They'd chosen New Year's week on purpose. They'd dressed it up as family time, a chance to reconnect, a fresh start. My sister had even texted me earlier that day, "Dress nice. It's a real restaurant." I understood the message. I always did. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever been treated like this by family, hit like and subscribe, because this story proves what happens when you stop staying silent. I drove home without music. Without tears. I replayed the moment again and again. Not because it hurt, but because it finally made sense. This was who they were when they thought they were winning. Growing up, I had learned to disappear, to be useful but invisible. I paid my way through school. I moved out early. I stopped asking for help. Every milestone I reached quietly irritated them. Especially my sister. She was the golden one. Married well. Lived loud. Needed constant applause. My parents fed that need like it was their job. I was the contrast. The example of what not to be. At that dinner, I saw something I hadn't before. Not cruelty. Not jealousy. Fear. They weren't humiliating me because I was weak. They were doing it because I wasn't dependent anymore. When I got home, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I opened my laptop. There are things families assume you'll never question. Papers you sign without reading. Arrangements explained vaguely and never revisited. I'd been included in those things once. Years ago. Back when my parents wanted to teach responsibility and used my name where it benefited them. Joint accounts. Shared property. Legal conveniences disguised as trust. I hadn't touched any of it in years. Not because I couldn't. Because I didn't want the drama. I wanted distance more than fairness. That night, distance stopped being enough. I pulled up old emails. Bank logins I hadn't used in years still worked. I expected resistance. Locked access. Something. Instead, everything opened easily. Too easily. The family cabin was still listed under 3 names. Mine included. The joint savings account was active. Large balance. Recent transfers. All visible. All traceable. I sat there for a long time, staring at the numbers, thinking about my father's laugh. My sister's smile. The way they'd waited for me to break. I didn't rush. I didn't make emotional decisions. I read documents. I checked dates. I verified signatures. I followed rules. Their rules. By morning, I knew something they didn't. Legally, I had every right to act. And morally, I was done protecting people who enjoyed hurting me. The next few days were quiet. No calls. No texts. They assumed I was licking my wounds somewhere, embarrassed, ashamed. That assumption was their biggest mistake. I met with a lawyer I'd worked with before. Not for revenge. For clarity. I laid everything out calmly. The shared assets, the history, the dinner. She didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, she nodded and said, "You've been more patient than most." We didn't raise our voices. We didn't plan anything dramatic. We followed procedures. Notices. Signatures. Timelines. By the end of the week, the cabin was listed and sold quickly. Market was high. Paperwork clean. My name was enough to authorize it. The joint accounts were closed the same day, funds separated according to ownership, transfers documented, receipts generated, no secrecy, no theft, just consequences. I didn't tell them. I didn't warn them. I didn't owe them that courtesy. I imagined my sister opening her mail days later, skimming envelopes, expecting bills and junk, and freezing when she saw the bank logo. I imagined my father rereading statements, convinced there had been a mistake. I wasn't there to see it. But I knew. Because when people build their power on your silence, they never prepare for what happens when you finally speak, even if you do it without a single word. The first call came 3 days after the statements arrived. I didn't answer. My phone buzzed again. Then again. My sister's name filled the screen like an accusation. I let it ring until it stopped, set the phone face down, and went back to what I was doing. For years, I'd trained them to believe I was reachable. Always available to explain myself. To soften things. To make it easier for them to stay exactly how they were. This time, I stayed silent. By that evening, the messages started, short at first, confused. "Did you do something with the cabin? There's an issue with the account. Call me. Now." I read every word without reacting. There was no apology in any of it, no concern. Just panic over money they assumed would always be there. The next morning, my father left a voicemail. His voice was tight, controlled, pretending this was a misunderstanding. "There seems to be a banking error," he said. "We need to fix this as a family." As a family. The same family that laughed at me over dinner. I deleted the voicemail and went to work. That week, I slept better than I had in years. No knots in my stomach. No rehearsed conversations in my head. Just space. I realized how much energy I'd spent anticipating their moods, bracing for their comments, adjusting myself to avoid conflict. Without them in my ear, my mind was quiet. On Friday, my sister showed up at my apartment. I hadn't told her where I lived. She must have asked our parents. Or looked it up. Either way, she stood there in heels and a tailored coat. The same woman who had leaned across a dinner table and told me I was invited out of pity. She knocked like she owned the place. I opened the door and didn't step aside. "What did you do?" she asked immediately. No hello. No hesitation. I looked at her calmly. "You should leave." Her eyes flicked past me, trying to see inside. "You can't just take things. That money wasn't yours." "It was," I said. My voice was even. Part of it still is. "You're being dramatic. Dad is furious." I almost laughed. Furious. Not ashamed. Not regretful. Furious. "You embarrassed us," she continued. "Selling the cabin without telling anyone. Do you know how that looks?" I leaned against the doorframe. "Like ownership." She stared at me like I'd slapped her. "You think this makes you powerful," she said. "You think this changes anything." I met her eyes. "It already has." For a moment, her confidence slipped, just for a second. Then she straightened, crossed her arms, and put on the familiar smile. The one meant to make me feel small. "You've always been jealous," she said. "This is just you acting out." I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain my intentions or list my reasons. "I'm not discussing this," I said. "All communication can go through my lawyer." That word finally landed, her face drained of color. "You got a lawyer?" I nodded. "Yes." She laughed, sharp and fake. "You're unbelievable." She turned and walked down the hall without another word. No threat. No apology. Just anger wrapped in disbelief. That night, my parents sent a group text. "We need to talk. This has gone too far. You've crossed a line." I didn't respond. The truth was simple. I hadn't crossed any line. I'd stepped out of one. Over the next few days, the tone shifted. The anger softened into bargaining. My mother called and left a voicemail crying, saying she didn't understand why I was doing this, asking what they'd done to deserve it. I listened once. Then I deleted it. I thought about the dinner again. About the laughter. About how easy it had been for them to humiliate me in public. How natural. They understood consequences. Just not when they applied to them. Another envelope arrived at their house the following week. This one official. Final. Documentation they couldn't ignore or talk their way out of. I received a copy at my address. I opened it slowly, checking every page. Everything was in order, clean, legal. Finished. That evening, my father called again. This time, he didn't leave a voicemail. He texted instead, "We need to meet. Just you and me." I stared at the screen for a long time. For years I would have gone, sat quietly. Let him talk. Accepted whatever version of reality he offered, just to keep the peace. I typed back one sentence. "No. I'm done meeting like this." There was no response. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. I felt settled. Like something heavy had finally been put down. They had built their authority on the idea that I would always be there to absorb their behavior without reacting. Once that stopped, everything else unraveled on its own. And they still didn't understand the worst part. I wasn't doing this to punish them. I was doing it so I could finally live without their voice in my head. The silence didn't last. 2 weeks after the cabin sold, my aunt called. She didn't bother pretending she was just checking in. Her voice was tight with urgency, like she'd been assigned a role. "What's going on with your parents?" she asked. "They're saying you stole from them." I let that sit for a moment. "They're saying that?" I asked calmly. "Well," she hesitated, "they're very upset. Your father is beside himself. You know how much that cabin meant to him." I pictured that place. The weekends I'd cleaned it while everyone else relaxed. The money I'd put into repairs that were never acknowledged. The way my name had been useful on paper and invisible in conversation. "It meant something to me too," I said. "That's why I sold my share." There was a pause. Confusion. The story she'd been given didn't match what I was saying. "You sold your share," she repeated. "Yes. That's not what they said." I didn't elaborate. I didn't defend myself. "If they have questions, they can talk to my lawyer." When I hung up, I realized something had shifted. The narrative they controlled so easily inside the family was starting to crack. Not because I was fighting it, but because facts don't bend the way emotions do. Over the next few days, more calls came. Cousins, an uncle, people who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly concerned. I answered only once more. "I didn't take anything," I said. "I separated what was already mine." That was enough. At work, I stayed focused. I didn't share details. I didn't vent. I didn't need validation anymore. I'd spent too long explaining myself to people who were invested in misunderstanding me. One afternoon, my sister sent a long message. No insults this time. No mocking. She wrote about stress, about bills, about how unfair it was that I'd acted. Without warning. She said our parents were struggling. That I was tearing the family apart. I read it carefully. Line by line. She never mentioned the dinner. She never acknowledged what she'd said. She never apologized. I didn't reply. That night, I thought about how often I'd been told to be the bigger person. How that phrase had always meant shrinking myself, so others could stay comfortable. I wasn't interested in being big or small anymore. I just wanted to be done. Another envelope arrived. This one addressed to me directly. Inside was a notice confirming the final distribution of funds. My portion was transferred into an account only I controlled. I stared at the number longer than I expected to. It wasn't life-changing money. It wasn't a jackpot. But it represented something I'd never been given by my family before. Acknowledgement. Not emotional. Not verbal. Legal. The next day, my parents showed up at my workplace. I saw them through the glass doors before they saw me. My mother clutched her purse with both hands. My father stood stiff beside her, jaw set. I didn't panic. I didn't hide. I told the receptionist not to let them back. When they realized they weren't being allowed in, my father raised his voice. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the posture. The entitlement. The expectation that access to me was automatic. Security escorted them out. My phone buzzed minutes later. "How dare you humiliate us like this? We are your parents." I typed back slowly. "You humiliated me first. This is just the boundary." No reply came after that. That was the moment it truly ended. Not with a fight. Not with closure they could understand. With a door they could no longer walk through. I went home that evening and sat alone in my apartment, lights low, city noise humming outside. I didn't feel lonely. I felt clear, for the first time. My life wasn't arranged around avoiding their reactions. There was no next confrontation to prepare for. No explanation left to give. They would tell their version of the story forever. About the ungrateful daughter. The betrayal. The money. I would live mine quietly. Without them. And that scared them more than anything I'd ever done before. The messages stopped after that. Not because they accepted what happened. But because there was nothing left to threaten me with. They'd tried anger. Shame. Family pressure. When none of it worked, silence became the last weapon. It didn't hurt the way it used to. A month passed. Then another. Holidays came and went without invitations, without group texts. Without the usual performance of pretending everything was fine. I noticed how much lighter my days felt without the constant anticipation of being judged. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived at my apartment, handwritten. My mother's writing. Careful. Slanted. The kind she used when she wanted to seem sincere. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and made coffee. I let it sit there while I cleaned, while I changed clothes, while I stood by the window watching traffic move below. When I finally opened it, I already knew what it would say. She wrote about love, about family, about how mistakes were made on all sides. She said my father was struggling, that my sister felt misunderstood. She asked if we could put everything behind us and start fresh. There was no mention of the dinner, no apology, no accountability, just an invitation to return to my old place. I folded the letter neatly and put it in a drawer. That night, my sister texted me again. Short this time. "Mom is really sick over this. You've made your point. Isn't that enough?" I stared at the screen, feeling something close to sadness. Not for what I'd lost, but for how predictable they still were. Even now, the responsibility for everyone's emotions was being placed back where it always had been. On me. I typed a response and deleted it. Typed another and erased that too. Then I sent one sentence. "I'm not coming back to be disrespected." She didn't reply. A few days later, I heard through a cousin that my parents were having financial trouble. Without the cabin, without the shared accounts, their lifestyle had tightened. Nothing dramatic. No collapse. Just inconvenience. The kind they'd never experienced before. I didn't feel guilty. I felt realistic. They had made choices assuming I would always be available to buffer the consequences. Once that buffer was gone, reality showed up. At work, I was offered a promotion. A quiet one. More responsibility, more trust. The kind that comes from consistency, not noise. I accepted without hesitation. When I told no one in my family, I realized how much I'd changed. I used to measure my success by whether they acknowledged it. Now, their awareness didn't matter. One evening, months later, I ran into my father at a grocery store. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no scene. He looked older, smaller. He hesitated when he saw me, like he wasn't sure what role to play anymore. "Hello," he said. I replied. We stood there for a moment between shelves of canned food. All the things that had never been said hung in the air. Apologies he couldn't form. Justifications I didn't want. "You didn't have to do it that way," he finally said. I met his eyes. "You didn't have to treat me the way you did." He looked away first. There was no resolution after that. No hug, no agreement, just honesty. I walked away feeling steady, not angry, not victorious, just finished. That night I thought about the woman who had sat at that dinner table, smiling politely while being humiliated. I didn't feel embarrassed for her. I felt proud. She'd known exactly when to leave. I stopped checking my phone for their names. Not as an act of discipline. It just happened naturally, the way habits fall away when they're no longer needed. Days passed without that familiar spike of tension. the instinct to brace myself for whatever tone or demand might come next. My life filled in the space they left behind. Mornings became slower. I started cooking again, not rushing through meals like they were a chore. I rearranged my apartment, moved furniture, threw away things I'd kept out of obligation. I realized how many objects in my life were there because someone else had decided they should be. Letting go felt quiet, almost boring. That's how I knew it was real. A final message came months later. From my mother, shorter than the letter. Less polished. Your father wants to know if there's any chance you'll reconsider. We are still your family. I read it once. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the urge to explain myself for the 100th time. I felt clarity. I typed back. I've already made my decision. Please respect it. That was the last message I sent to any of them. I heard later that they told people I'd changed. That success had made me cold. That I'd chosen money over family. I didn't correct the story. People who needed me to be the villain would always find a reason. What mattered was that I no longer needed to defend my version of the truth. I was living it. On the anniversary of that dinner, I went out alone. Same city. Different restaurant. I ordered what I wanted, drank slowly, watched the room without feeling watched myself. No one laughed at me. No one tested me. No one expected me to shrink. When the bill came, I paid it and stayed seated for a while longer, just breathing, just existing in a moment that belonged entirely to me. I thought about the family cabin one last time. About how they'd assumed it would always be there. How they'd built comfort on access they hadn't earned. Losing it hadn't ruined them. But it had shown them something they'd spent a lifetime avoiding. I wasn't powerless. Power, I learned, doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Silence. Walking away without asking permission. It looks like choosing yourself when no one else ever did. I don't know if my parents ever understood what they lost. I don't know if my sister ever connected her words at that dinner to the consequences that followed. I stopped needing them to understand. Some endings don't come with apologies or reconciliation. They come with distance. With boundaries that stay firm even when tested. With a sense of self that no longer bends to keep the peace. That was my justice. Not revenge. Not punishment. Just freedom. And I carried it with me quietly, every day after.